So my name is Nick Gibson, Enterprise Desktop Practice Manager with Forsyth. I want to present on how app virtualization can accelerate a virtual desktop deployment. Forsyth in 2009 saw a pretty significant uptick in interest around VDI from our customers across the board. And since then, we've launched an enterprise desktop practice, and we've done quite a few deployments, large, small, and in between. And we pretty quickly started to see a trend that customers who focused on assessing and virtualizing their applications first were much more successful rolling VDI out long term. So that's kind of the core message of this, and I break it up into a couple parts. I talk first about our view of how to implement VDI, how FinApp specifically can help technically make VDI easier and more seamless to implement. And then at the end, I go into some of the hard TCO numbers and quantify some of the cost savings that you can build into your business plan to make the VDI case easier to get off the ground. So with that, I'll get started, if this works. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. All right, so 2010 especially was a really strong year for virtual desktop adoption. And I think that's because some of the core elements that are needed for VDI to be successful really matured to the point that it's feasible to implement it on a much broader scale than you could before. So first, with protocol options, which directly influence that user experience, and that's one of the most important things. You're delivering desktops to your end users. So delivering that robust user experience, which has to be as good or better than what they already experience, is key, or you'll never get widespread adoption. And now with PC over IP, you've got some other options available above and beyond RDP and ICA, which historically haven't been perfect for every case. The single disk image technologies out there now, whether it's streamed operating systems, link clones, View Composer, VDI can be a very challenging CapEx case to make. Desktops are extremely cheap, so when you're going up against a commodity that can cost $600 to $800, it's tough to make that business case. And the back-end SAN cost is a big portion of that total cost. So using things like link clones, streamed operating systems, you can really shrink that back-end SAN cost and start to build a more compelling business case. And this one, I think, is especially important. The two core verticals that we've really seen interest grow has been healthcare and finance. And if you think about some of the users in those verticals, you've got roaming clinicians, doctors, and remote branch offices in finance. Those types of users have to remain productive, whether that link is up or not. And this year, the vendors are staggering their release, but you're seeing client hypervisors coming from all the major vendors. And what that does is allow users to work on their VDI workstations. If that link goes down, they can still keep working, stay productive, and then they seamlessly replicate data back up to the data center when that link comes back up. And that's really key to be able to address different use cases within some of these organizations. And then app virtualization, which I think is the most important part. So Forsyth this year implemented one of the largest FinApp deployments that VMware has at 75,000 endpoints and 1,000 applications. And I think when you start to see organizations implement this on such a big scale across 75,000 virtual and physical PCs, you know that it's really gained kind of widespread adoption and matured to the point, and you've got some great success stories to point back to. So I'll talk quickly about what the desktop environment looks like right now. So you probably all experience delivering desktop services is a huge operational challenge for your IT department. And there's three core components that they need to focus on right now. You've got your core applications, which is the most important piece, delivering applications seamlessly, cost-effectively to your end users. There's all the different access issues, updates, patches, security patches, all those things to take into account when delivering applications, and that plays into the next piece, which is building that consistent, predictable user experience, ensuring that your users have access to the things they need to do their job on a day-to-day basis, and that could be network shares, it could be printers, but ensuring they have that access whether they're on the LAN, whether they're at home, or whether they're roaming in hotels or in different locations. And then, of course, the operating system. And this is now even more challenging with all the different endpoints out there, with laptops, iPads, smartphones, all the different access methods that users want to be able to connect to anytime, anywhere from any device. So with VDI, you can really switch these arrows. With app virtualization, you decouple the applications from that user experience and from that base OS, deliver the applications centrally, and become much more nimble. So now with some of the technologies that have been released this year, you can actually take if needed, roll back to a good point. If a user calls your help desk and says, Word won't work for me, you can say, well, when was the last time it did work? If they say yesterday, you can roll back to that point. That user's back up and running very quickly. So there's big OpEx support benefits. And now with products such as RTO, AppSense, Liquidware's Profile Unity, you can decouple that user experience from the OS and the applications. You can back it up, and you can move it between different operating systems seamlessly. So if a user does go down, they're not spending an entire day trying to get their desktop back looking and feeling the same way it was before there was that failure. You can take and push that user experience back down seamlessly, and they're back up and running with everything they're used to in a productive manner very quickly. And the benefit to the OS is it's cleaner, and it's delivered as a service, on demand, very seamlessly, and things that used to be very cumbersome, potentially risky, like a Windows 7 upgrade, can now become a non-event. And I have a quick demo that we did for a customer this year where we showed not only a disaster recovery scenario, but a very seamless Windows 7 upgrade. So being able to take something that used to be tremendously time-consuming and make it that easy is all about decoupling that base OS. So let me look at what an OS image is right now. And I think in the early days, I saw customers start to dip their toe in VDI about 5 years ago. And I think at that time, customers believed that they could tackle it the same way they did server virtualization, that it would kind of be a seamless continuation of the success that they'd already had virtualizing their servers. You could just physically migrate a desktop into your data center, run it on VMware, and everything would be great. And the server virtualization is a very compelling TCO to make. It's a much easier TCO to make. And I think what customers didn't realize is desktops are inherently different. They have more moving parts. You've got the end user to consider. They're much more challenging to virtualize, and just doing a straight physical to virtual migration doesn't give you that TCO that you need. You've got to start to look at all the different pieces that comprise a desktop, the heavily embedded registry settings. You've got constant patches and updates, patches spread across disparate locations. You've got your managed applications that you know about that you push out through some type of application deployment mechanism, and you've got these unmanaged apps that make their way into the environment all the time. Users bring them in as a one-off, and they end up staying, and you're not aware of them. They can potentially conflict with other applications in the system, and they can be very damaging and very labor-intensive to support. You've got your constant upgrades, and the worst part, you've got these security exploits that everybody deals with, the viruses, the continual threats. If you want to virtualize something like this desktop image, you really start to have to peel away these components and make them what we call a layered desktop approach, or what VMware calls the composite desktop, where you simplify the OS, you pull these pieces out, and with something like View Composer, you can take those patches and security updates out of the operating system, where you patch a Delta disk, you can test it on one machine before you roll it out, and then very quickly roll it out to all the master images running off that Delta disk. In the event that there's issues, you can also pull that back. So the more you layer these things on, the more flexible you are in supporting your end users. With that desktop personality, you can take, using RTO, which was supposed to be in this, released, I believe, at this VMworld, but should be released soon, RTO or any of the other products out there, you can decouple that user experience, move it between OSs, back it up, and the same with the application profiles. And ThinApp lends itself very well to this. So ThinApp gives you the ability to take and put that profile, which is really a sandbox. You can put it anywhere, whether it's on a network, whether it's backed up, whether it's between different OSs. But the more flexible you become with these pieces, the more you can layer them, the more you can focus on what's important, which is delivering applications to your end users efficiently in the most cost-effective manner. So now I've got, this is a high-level whiteboard representation that we did with a large financial customer who we implemented 75,000 ThinApp seats for. We first sat down with them. They were very interested in the technology. We'd piloted it. They understood how it worked. They had tested out a few mission-critical applications that they knew they needed to focus on. But as we walked through what does their environment look like, and this is very common among customers, you see that it's just a really messy landscape. You've got disparate, unique images. Each business unit has unique applications, different images, different patches, different versions of applications, and different versions of all those corresponding dependencies that everybody struggles with. The .NETs, the Java. So you see it's very, very messy and very difficult to tackle. And what we've had a lot of success with is doing application virtualization assessments. And there's a variety of different tools and technologies out there that allow you to do this, but they all have a similar function. They all go out and they touch a subset of desktops, and they pull back a detailed amount of information. So you start to see what business units are using what applications, what applications are not in use, what unmanaged apps that I don't know about are in the environment, and you start to get all these usage metrics that let you build the case for, here's the applications I want to tackle first, and here's how long it's going to take for me to actually run through an application virtualization effort. And what we've found is it's much faster to virtualize your applications than it is to virtualize your desktops. So if you can get a handle on that first, you're in a much better position to virtualize desktops at a later date on a use-by-use case basis. And after virtualizing the apps, you move away from this somewhat messy scenario to something that's much more elegant, where you have an application catalog, an operating system catalog, and applications are streamed onto different operating systems on demand. The beauty of FinApp is that on the right side, that application catalog can be as simple as just a network share. So it's a very low initial cost, and it's something you probably already have in your environment. On the left side, that OS system catalog can be virtual or physical desktops. We've tackled, with most of our customers who are moving far down the path with VDI, we've tackled the applications first. So virtualizing them across physical desktops, and then virtualizing desktops later. And what's interesting about that application catalog, being able to stream apps from a network share, not having to purchase additional streaming database servers, provisioning servers, things like that, I think is very powerful. And what I find interesting is this is the way that Citrix messages against FinApp. Their view is FinApp doesn't have all that management back end that something like a XenApp does have, so it's not a true product. And I've seen them we've done a lot of different bake-offs against these products. What they'll say is it doesn't compete, it's just a very simple packaging engine, and it's missing out on a lot of this functionality. When you think about big companies who already have, whether it's LandDesk, BMC, Altiris, if you already have that application provisioning process in place, you don't want to replicate it. You don't want more complexity. Something that just fits seamlessly into your existing environment is actually very powerful. So the argument cuts both ways, and we've seen that in many cases the argument kind of backfires on them where a customer says, I don't want to have another deployment process. I already have this that works. I just want something that fits into it. FinApp has executables, MSIs. It'll fit right into the existing app deployment process you already have in place. So we've seen a lot of success with that. This is just to emphasize how powerful it is once you get to this state where all these pieces are layered on demand. This is a demonstration that we gave to a customer to address a use case they'd identified, which was 5,000 mission-critical users that they knew had to be up all the time, no matter what. So what we did is we built a small proof of concept. We implemented ESX, View, AppSense for the profile management piece, and FinApp, and we brought one of these mission-critical users in. He had his laptop, which was running Windows XP. We had him open his laptop. He logged on. He got his profile. We had him launch some applications. And in this case, it wasn't Word. He had an application which was a two-way voice-over IP soft phone, and it was very important for him. If you dialed a number, it would ring on his laptop. So this was the core. This was the main way that people accessed him, and he used it all day long. So we had him make some changes. His changes were pushed up to a personalized cache that stored them temporarily. And then we shut his laptop, and we said, this has now been destroyed. And what happens, those changes are pushed up to a SQL database, and we then walked him over to a thin client that connected back to a virtual desktop running Windows 7 with applications FinApped onto it. So just a basic virtual desktop with no personality, nothing, no user attached to it yet. As soon as that user logs on and started to run applications, all his personality settings, everything that made that unique, were pushed down to that desktop instantly. And he was able to, what we did, we picked up a phone, we called that number, it rang on his thin client. He had up to a 5-minute mark. He had all the changes he'd made. He had any Word documents, any updates to documents that he may have had. And that's an extremely powerful demo. And we also then said, all right, look at the taskbar. Here we've also upgraded you to Windows 7. So he was on XP before. He was back up and running after that laptop was theoretically destroyed. Back up and running in less than 10 minutes, and his underlying OS had also been upgraded. So this customer has since then deployed this same scenario across 5,000 users, and it's working perfectly for this DR-type scenario. And they're going to replicate portions of it for a potential Windows 7 upgrade. So some of the strengths with FinApp, we do a lot of bake-offs. Forsyth deals with everyone. So we're partners with Citrix. We go into a customer, sometimes it's a big Citrix shop, they have an existing XenApp environment, and we do a lot of different bake-offs. And we've seen a lot of success with ThinApp, and some of the strengths and some of the things that we've seen that causes it to win in these bake-offs are these components. One of the biggest one being the agentless architecture. So if you think about XenApp or AppV, they all require agents in every single one of those end desktops. So you're still managing all those desktops that are scattered all over your environment. ThinApp is a single EXE, a single MSI. It deploys seamlessly out. There's no installation, there's no changes to the registry, there's no back-end agents, and that makes supporting it much, much easier in comparison to some of these other products. And I mentioned it seamlessly fits into any environment. We've seen that as a real strength. I was in a room with an IT manager for a large corporation and a bunch of his team, and I asked, how many of you want to support a second deployment process, a second application deployment process? And of course, nobody raised their hands because they're all working too hard and they don't want more work. So something that just fits right into what they have and what's working can actually be a real strength to the product. Conflict-free portable applications. So ThinApp runs, when you run an application on a machine, it runs in a self-contained bubble, and there's a lot of technical ThinApp presentations going on at VMworld this year, but it's completely self-contained, and it doesn't touch or interact with any other application on the box. So if you've got unmanaged apps that historically could have caused conflicts, ThinApp really helps to resolve that. And we've actually seen a couple customers whose back-end deployment process is Citrix, but they had applications that wouldn't play nice together, that wouldn't run together, and so they used ThinApp to package them and then Citrix to deploy them out. So that conflict-free, that way of running, you can run things like different versions of .NET. So if you have 3 applications all written to different versions of .NET or different versions of Java, you can run those on the same box through ThinApp. And there's a process called AppSync or AppLink, where when an application starts, it's smart enough to go and look for its specific version of .NET or Java that it needs. Another application on the system will start, and it can go use a different version. That's impossible to do if you natively install these products. The only way to do that is with something that encapsulates those running applications into a bubble. And the security. So one technical piece to see, ThinApp is one of the only products that runs completely in user mode, so it has no underlying kernel access, which means a horribly badly behaving application physically can't harm the system underneath. Everything runs in its own sandbox. Everything is self-contained, sandboxed, and you don't require any admin rights. You could walk to a kiosk where you have nothing but guest rights and run any ThinApp application, knowing that it's not going to touch, change, or harm that underlying system. So those are some of the big strengths that we see above and beyond the other products that we've done bake-offs against, and it's some of the reasons we see ThinApp winning in many scenarios. So I talked earlier about the application virtualization assessment that we've had a lot of success with, and we actually spearhead almost every one of our app virtualization efforts with an assessment such as this. It's an assessment that was created with VMware. It can be delivered either by VMware or by any certified partner, and it's very flexible in its size. So at its smallest level, it's 5 applications. It can be implemented in less than 2 weeks and very affordable. A larger assessment, the biggest one that we did, was 1,000 applications, and it took months. So very flexible, very customizable to what your requirements are. And what is it? I really think this statement is true, as tacky as it is. And I think of an example from years ago. It was about 4 years ago when ThinApp was first released. I was doing a big VDI project for a bank in Australia, and we'd started to wrap up the VDI portion of the project. One of the IT guys saw ThinApp, and VMware had just purchased ThinStall, rebranded it, released it as ThinApp. He got really excited, and he installed it on his laptop. And you can be up and packaging applications wrong in a matter of 15 minutes with ThinApp. So he put it on his laptop. He packaged up the latest version of Office that the company hadn't upgraded to yet. He tested it. He was really proud of himself. He put it up in a network share, and he sent out an email to everybody saying, if you want the latest version of Office, here you go. You can download it from this share, launch it on your computer, and look how cool it is. What he didn't realize is when he packaged up Outlook, he'd packaged up his entire mailbox. So his inbox, his sent mail, all of his archived, anything he'd sent or received at his time in the company. So if you launched that package, you didn't have his username or passwords. You couldn't log in and send and receive mail as him, but you could say cancel, work offline, and you could read everything he'd ever sent. So he realized that pretty quickly. It was a pretty bad day for him. He said, nobody touch it, give it back, and by that time it was already out. So it was just too late. And I think that just exhibits how much trouble you can get into quickly if you don't do things right up front. So something like an application assessment does, for one, it ensures you address things like this up front because you understand how am I going to package applications, but it gives you so much more. It also looks at your environment, categorizes your applications into buckets of complexity so you know level of effort and where to start. You get the end result is you get a very detailed analysis where your applications are packaged into low, medium, high levels of complexity. A low complexity app may take 2 hours to package, medium may take 4, high may take 8. So you can start to say, how many concurrent packaging efforts do I have to have going on to meet my specific timelines? And we've had a lot of success, and that's how we've been able to do things like virtualize 1,000 applications across 75,000 endpoints. You understand, can I do this internally with the resources I have in-house? Do I need to bring contractors? Do I need to work with partners? But until you do an assessment to understand what's the complexity level of my applications, you really can't start to make that level of effort, and you don't understand what your project timeline is going to be. So I've got 3 case studies, and these are some of these are case studies done by VMware, but they're all customers that did an application assessment successfully, focused on the apps first, and are now moving forward in some way, shape, or form with VDI. So this first one was a medium-sized biotech, very low complexity application as it turned out. It was a pain point where SAP 7 wouldn't work on Windows 7, and they had an upcoming Windows 7 deployment that was being pushed very aggressively. They talked to Microsoft. Microsoft said, no, you can't run that on Windows 7. They went through, they packaged it on XP, and then ran it on a Windows 7 machine through ThinApp, put it through their UAT, and it worked great. So that was their big inhibitor from being able to move forward. And you'll see kind of a trend, and it's really a sign of the times right now, that the Windows 7 upgrade is really an impetus for a lot of customers to look at app virtualization and VDI at the moment. When we talk to a lot of customers, and the next use case is very, very common, they have all these issues where their applications just won't run on Windows 7. Whether it's homegrown or whether it's native apps, we're seeing a 30 to 40% failure rate trying to run these apps on any kind of Windows 7 image. So this next one was Visual Basic 6, an old version of Visual Basic, and a customer just had 50-plus homegrown applications that they'd written in it, and they obviously didn't want to have to rewrite all those apps. So we went through, and they did the same thing. They approached Microsoft. They begged them, tried to see if they could somehow run Visual Basic 6 on Windows 7, and the answer was a definitive no. So they packaged it up with ThinApp, tied those applications to Visual Basic 6 running on Windows 7 through AppLink, and pushed everything through UAT, and it ran great. So again, it was a way that they're now halfway through their Windows 7 upgrade, and they haven't had to rewrite any of their applications. So it was another really good kind of success story with Windows 7, and this last one is the most interesting. This was a large insurance company running IBM WebSphere Integration Developer Package, which is just a beast of a program. It's a 10.5 gig program, and it takes 7 hours to deploy. So this customer would push it out anytime they had a new developer or an existing developer that did an upgrade or messed up his system, it would be an 8-hour process to just install this application. And they'd have to do it every single time. So they came to VMware and said, is our IBM, our 10.5 gig package, a candidate for ThinApp? And VMware said, honestly, probably not. Right? ThinApp historically didn't do very well with packages of that size. They said, well, we'd like to try it anyways. So, fine, they went off. It took 7 hours to package. And at the end, they put it up on a network share. They streamed it down to their developers. It worked. It passed their standard UAT. And then they were surprised. Their developers actually came back and said, we think it runs significantly faster than it did when it was native. So they were, in this case, developers were clamoring, saying, can you deploy it this way? Because we like it a lot more. It's much more responsive. So this was a huge success case. And when you think about how this would tie into your VDI business case, that's when you're taking desktops, right now, physical desktops, disk is extremely cheap. You can get 80 gigs on a physical desktop for a matter of $100. When you move to virtual desktop and you've got a back-end SAN, even if it's lower cost storage, iSCSI or NAS or something like that, you're still paying more for gig than you would be on a physical desktop. If you can pull 10 gig out of every single one of your images, that's a huge amount of savings. If you're talking about 10,000 virtual desktops, that's terabytes that you're pulling out of that back-end SAN requirement, and a significant decrease in the total CapEx expenditure that you need to get that business case off the ground. So these large applications are a great use case. They were a big success, and now subsequent versions of ThinApp are coming out supporting large footprint applications such as this. So this app compatibility on Windows 7, this is by and large somewhat new, but it's turning out to be something that's working very well. It's not guaranteed by VMware, But we've seen a lot of customers, because of the pain involved in a Windows 7 upgrade, say, we don't care if it's not guaranteed, we just want to try it. And we're seeing about a 70% success rate. And at this point, VMware is understanding, okay, this is potentially a very good use case for us. We're going to buy into it, and we're hearing there may be some best practices developed, and there may be some checks in the capture and build process. So if you're actually building ThinApp packages, you may be able to say, you can build it on XP, and then say, I want to understand if this would launch on Windows 7. But what I find most interesting, and I think the thing that's going to come out the fastest, is the different assessment vendors. And the two biggest ones are a company called Liquidware and there's a company called Lakeside. They each make assessment products. But what they're talking about doing is during the assessment, they'll look at an application, they'll say, is it a good candidate? Is it a bad candidate? Is it high, medium, low? And will it run, could it be packaged on XP, and then subsequently run on Windows 7? So it's just more really valuable information that you can get back in the assessment process before you actually even start doing any work. And I think you're going to see that come out sometime in the near future from one of those vendors. I should have clicked these. And if you've ever seen this, IE6 actually still accounts for 11% of the web browsing market, even though at this point it's an ancient browser. And it's even more within companies who've written web-based applications that only run on IE6. You can't run IE6 on Windows 7, and you definitely can't run IE6 next to IE8 in any other way except using ThinApp. So this we've already seen a lot of success with. There's in the latest version of ThinApp, there's actually a button where when you're capturing an application, you can say, I want to extract IE6, and you get a nice little self-contained EXE or MSI, and you can push it anywhere. You can run IE8, IE6 side by side on a Windows 7 box. You can have those web-based applications that only work on IE6, tie them to that IE6 executable, and they'll launch in an older browser, and there's no need to rewrite them. So this is something we see that just saves customers a lot of pain. You don't want to be doing something as complex as a Windows 7 upgrade while at the same time trying to rewrite your applications just to work. So we are seeing Windows 7 as a pretty significant use case. So the IE6 piece has been happening for a while. It's something that's very popular. Extending the life of these legacy applications, ThinApp does a great job on that. And eliminating these application incompatibilities because you're building conflict-free applications on the box. They don't touch, they don't interact with each other. You can put them side by side without any issues. And you can really simplify these application upgrades. You upgrade centrally. You can push out those new changes very quickly. There's a process called App Sync with ThinApp where when you launch an app, it'll check a web page. If there's a new version, it'll download the delta differences. And the next time that user launches that version, they're running that new upgraded executable. If for some reason you've pushed out the wrong upgrade, it's very easy to roll back. So you're in a position where you can really support in a much more nimble fashion. And this new use case, which is large footprint applications, which we're finding it's more and more interesting and just a great way to pull money out of that business case. So how does all this help accelerate the deployment of VDI? Well, first, and I think the most important, is the application assessment. You really understand your app landscape and position yourself for a much more successful packaging effort where you decouple the applications from the base OS. And by understanding the application landscape and understanding your users, another thing you get back from some of these assessment tools is how do my users use these apps? What's the I/O footprint? How much CPU? How much memory? You can start to extrapolate out what kind of storage will I have to buy? How many spindles? What size? Do I need fiber? Can I go with iSCSI? Can I go with NAS? You can start to build that business case, build the TCO around it before you get started. By decoupling the applications from that base OS, you decrease the number of OS images. So when I showed the messy slide at the start, that's very common. There's normally an OS image for every different business unit or even a mix of images for different units within each business, within each unit. So you very quickly get very messy, very hard to support automated images. And if you can make that OS simple and clean, you can decrease those images to a minimal number. And then you can really deliver what VMware calls the composite desktop delivered on demand, which from what I've seen is the only real way to go through and successfully deliver VDI. So I talked a bit about the business case. And I mentioned that desktops are cheap. So when and I don't know how many people have gone through this, but when you're trying to make the case to get VDI off the ground, the CapEx expenditure can be very challenging. And that's because you're dealing with a commodity that's $600 to $800. So So if you're trying to make the case to replace something that's already that cheap, it's a tough business case to build. And I want to look at some of the upfront costs associated with VDI. There's a lot that people don't realize. For one, you've got the ESX server hardware. A lot of customers think, I've already got an ESX farm in-house, I've already deployed servers, I'll just push desktops onto that. That normally ends up being a very bad idea. So especially at the start, delivering desktops to end users is all about that first experience. And if you blend virtual desktops onto your existing server farm, there's a good chance you'll get resource contention, that initial experience will be bad, and it just makes it harder to build momentum for any subsequent virtual desktop effort. So really, you want to take into account buying new ESX hardware. Thin clients, if you can't repurpose existing PCs, you're forced to purchase thin clients. They're cheaper than fat clients, but they're obviously not free, and they can run anywhere between $200 to $400, depending on how many USB ports, multi-monitor, and things that you need. So that can be half the cost of a desktop right there. And then the back-end SAN, the back-end storage, which is by and large the biggest cost. And you've got all the licensing, your Virtual Center servers, obviously your OS licensing for Virtual Center. You've got your Windows XP or Windows 7. There's no Vista. We haven't seen a lot of people implement Vista. And then your VDI brokering software. And then there's licensing that people just don't think of. It's what a lot of people have called this Microsoft tax, this VECD. And it used to be, Microsoft actually changed this due to widespread anger from customers. But at this point, if you have Microsoft Software Assurance, this will cost you $10 per endpoint. If you don't have Microsoft Software Assurance, this is $100 for every endpoint that you just have to pay to Microsoft because you're doing a virtual desktop deployment. So in a lot of cases, it's a Microsoft tax. $100 when you're trying to justify replacing something that's only $600 can be the difference between an effort that gets off the ground and an effort that doesn't. That can be a pretty significant task that people just don't think of. So look at some of the cost savings that you gain from app virtualization. And the next slide, I quantify them and show kind of the total amount that you can build into your business case. But first, automated deployments. And I think that example of the 10 gig large footprint application is a perfect example of the savings you gain from this. So not having to spend 8 hours deploying a big app, not having to put 10 gig on every back-end image, there's real cost savings with that. Obviously, you're patching and updates. Being able to patch and update centrally as opposed to pushing patches over a disparate network, dealing with transmission failures, having to leave machines on all night so those patches can push out and be installed, having to do the next morning, have the users check, did the patches install properly, did any fail, did they conflict with an application I didn't know was on the system. You take all that away, you patch centrally, you test, you roll it out conflict-free, you don't worry about a lot of those issues. Non-standard applications. There's real savings, and this comes in large part from the app virtualization assessment. You start to identify what applications are out there that I don't know about, that could be causing problems, that my support team doesn't even know how to troubleshoot, and you can either get them out of the environment or you get them into a supportable state, where you know how to push them, you can support them properly, and you only get that from doing the assessments. And then image management. We've talked about this, but decreasing the number of images. There's huge, real productivity savings to decreasing that total number of images. And there's real cost savings that you can quantify. Hardware provisioning and replacement. And this applies not just to thin clients, but also to fat clients. Obviously, with a thin client, if it breaks, you take it, you throw it away, you pull a new one from a back room, you put it in place, you plug the network cable in, and you're up and running. So very, very easy in comparison to a different hardware failure. But even a fat client, if a fat client fails, you don't have to layer on sequentially all the different applications, all the .NETs, all the updates. You push a basic OS image, an updated OS image, and then you layer the applications, the user personality down very quickly. It's a much faster process than it has been historically. So if you add all this up, what are the total savings? And this is from the Enterprise PC Lifecycle magazine. They estimate you can save $148 per endpoint, which is extremely significant when you're putting together that business plan. If you think about kind of the sweet spot we've seen is 5,000 to 10,000 virtual desktops, you think about rolling out VDI for 10,000 endpoints, saving $148 on each one is almost $1.5 million. So that's a big difference that you can gain upfront very quickly without having to purchase back-end streaming or infrastructure. You can virtualize the apps across your physical machines, across any existing virtual machines, and realize those savings before you have to make that big CapEx expenditure. So in summary, virtualizing the applications first really does allow you to decouple the OS and that end user personality, making it more nimble for you to support them. It simplifies that OS management. You can create a much more compelling business case for VDI, decrease that rollout time, reduce your effort, reduce issues around legacy apps, run the same apps on Windows 7 that you would on XP, decrease that complexity during your OS and patch maintenance, and as a result, set much more aggressive, supportable operating levels, and just gain a much clearer view of what the application landscape is through the app virtualization assessment. So with that, I will open it up for questions, if anybody has any. Yes?
What about the whole topic of license management? I mean, particularly large companies, one of my points for us, basically being able to better manage licensing.
Right.
And not pushing things out with a $1 billion business in itself.
Right.
So I would expect some substantial savings out of, let's say, being able to retire applications. Is there any back-end infrastructure behind that would allow that so that I give people only access, download the application, I have that valid for only 3 months, if it's not extended, I shut it down.
Yeah, absolutely. There's now you're going to see more and more around the ThinApp API and the ThinApp SDK, which is being released. Through that API, you can set, when you build a ThinApp package, you can tell it, I want it to report its usage back to a central server. You can look at that central server and see, here's all the applications in use, here's my licenses, and very quickly compare them. So you get that snapshot and understanding, and then, like you said, you can start to retire applications or licenses that aren't being used. But that's a new feature that's being built onto the ThinApp API that I believe is just being released this year. So does that answer the question? Or? Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. And there needs to be a better way to do it right now. So a big company that we worked with brought the same thing up. That mechanism doesn't exist right now. So the API, the underlying infrastructure to do it with the release of the API is there. Now you just need a product that will actually take and give you that pane of glass view of what the license usage is. So I think that's going to exist very soon. And when it does, I agree, it should definitely be bundled into the business case. Any other questions? Wow, no questions. All right. Thanks, everyone.